All right, so we are Team Neuroflow, and to introduce our student team, we have Alex and I as the engagement leads, and then Vikram, Akshat, Abhi, Johnny, and Naveen as our wonderful analysts, and then Mayan was our TA, and Patrizio, our mentor. So thank you, everyone, for all of your hard work on this project. In terms of where we were during this project, a few places in the US, and then Japan, Hong Kong, and India. So we were able to coordinate across a lot of different time zones to pull this project together. In terms of a general overview of Neuroflow, Neuroflow is a SaaS healthcare technology company that enables behavioral health access to people who suffer from different behavioral health conditions. So with this project, Neuroflow is looking to build statistical models to identify users that were at high risk of churn or attrition from the app. And these models will inform product design, promotional offerings, and different ways to re-engage users. We worked really closely with Bill from Neuroflow, so thank you for all of your support, Bill. And then we just have the rest of our team listed here as well. So taking a high-level look at the project in general, again, as I mentioned, our prompt was to identify app user churn and recommendations for user experience. And we did that by conducting an exploratory data analysis and experimenting with a couple of statistical models, including BG-NBD, which is traditionally used in a retail setting, and then also a clustering analysis. And we eventually determined that a clustering analysis was the best method to analyze the Neuroflow users. And we identified 4 different clusters, which the team will talk more about later on in the presentation. So from our clustering analysis, we identified several ways to convert rarely active users to very active users on the Neuroflow app. And those 6 recommendations included monitoring homework completion rates as an indicator of churn, looking more at older customers who are more likely to be inactive, as well as assigning inactive customers a behavioral health specialist, and then adapting offerings of a self-service tool for Neuroflow called Empower to align more closely to other offerings that have more patient engagement. And then the 5th one recommendation is to encourage large organizations to mimic behaviors of smaller organizations, which have more engaged patients. And then our last one was to convert remaining SMS, so text notifications, to push or email. And we'll go more into depth later in the presentation on some of those. But in terms of our general approach for this project, we broke it up into 4 different phases. The first phase was our logistics setup. We did some exploratory data analysis, as I mentioned. We built the models in our 2nd phase, and then the final phase was just wrapping up with our final presentation and bringing everything together. So I'll pass it off to Alex.
Thank you, Anna. After we ran the k-means clustering model.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Anna, do you mind just putting it in the presenter mode? I think the you can see the next slide right now. So the slide itself is a little bit small.
Okay, thank you for pointing that out. Let me just reshare really quick.
Sorry, Alex, I didn't want to cut off your flow, but I think it'd be easier for people to see the bigger.
Is this any better?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Much better, thank you. After we implemented the k-means clustering model to identify customers that fell into highly engaged clusters and those who fell into not very engaged clusters, we did so by clustering on 2 key dimensions. One was recency, which asks how recently that user was active. Was it a long time ago or very recently? As well as how frequently they were active on the app, which is just asking how often do they engage with the app. When we clustered on these 2 key dimensions, we were able to identify 4 distinct clusters. And the waterfall chart on the left shows out of a total of 45,000 patients on the app, how many broke into each of the 4 clusters. So we have 22,000 falling into never active. They never did an activity before. We have 15,000 falling into rarely active. They have a history of doing activities, of being engaged, but it's not that strong. We have 4,000 that fall into the cluster at risk of churn, which means that even though they are moderately engaged, because they are either weak on the recency dimension or on the frequency dimension, they are at risk of churning. And so we should keep an eye on that group. And then finally, we have 3,000 users that fall into the very active cluster. So these are highly engaged people. They're strong on both recency and frequency. And these are the sort of users we want everyone to be like. And then the scatter plot on the right is just a two-dimensional intuitive way of showing how each of these four clusters fall on the two-dimensional plane. In terms of adding a face or a persona for each cluster, as Anna mentioned, after identifying the four distinct clusters, we did some additional EDA. We found that there were a long list of attributes that made each cluster distinct from the other three clusters. And by looking at these distinct attributes, whether it was demographic attributes, whether it was patient background, diagnosis type, the provider they came from, we were able to sort of put a face to each of these four clusters. So in terms of the weakest cluster, those who are never active, we can call them dormant derricks. In terms of the rarely active cluster, we call them idle iris. In terms of the cluster that is moderately engaged but at risk of churn, we call them the casual Carolines. And then finally, for our very active clusters, we called them engaged Emilys. How we came up with male or female names depended on sort of the demographic balance of male versus female in that cluster, and so on. And we can go into more depth in later slides here.
Great. So one of the key attributes which defined churn was how the organizations interacted with the patients. And there were two main ways they do this. One is homework. So they just give the patients homework. And secondly, they assign activities. It's important to note that activities can also be self-assigned, but we focused on what proportion of activities were actually assigned. And both these factors showed strong correlations with churn. So the Pearson coefficient for homework completion rate was 0.666. The negative there, I think, is as a typo. And then the assigned activities 0.169. But from the bar charts, it's quite clear that the active clusters have far higher completion rates and proportion of assigned activities. So from this, our key takeaways are, firstly, obviously, users in the more active clusters have a higher homework completion rate, and therefore we should monitor homework completion rate as an indicator of churning. When homework completion rate falls below around 50%, it's important to try and re-engage the customer, and we go into methods of how to do this later on in our presentation. And then the second takeaway is that users in the active cluster have a higher proportion of assigned activities. So we should try and get about 35% of all activities that a user does be assigned instead of self-assigned.
Building off this, we began analyzing the product tier. Now, Neuroflow exactly has three main product tiers. We've got EngageBH, which is an evidence-based treatment and remote patient monitoring platform. We've got Integrate Health, which is for providers integrating behavioral health in their care plans. And the last one, which is Empower, which is a self-service tool. Now, as seen in this slide, we discovered relatively significant differences between the different product tiers. We see that EngageBH users are likely to be more active compared to the other two. And while Integrate users are fairly active, we see that Empower users are significantly less engaged. Analyzing Empower users, we discovered that they are young, predominantly male, have an unspecified behavioral disorder, and do not have a behavioral health specialist. A lot of these characteristics were in agreement with the demographics that we identified in our low-value segments, as we elaborated earlier. From this, we reached the conclusion that product tier is highly indicative of engagement. And to this end, we recommended Neuroflow that they look for ways to adopt features and offerings from Engage and Integrate as they build Empower, and to further make use of how we've come up with our high-value segment in their marketing efforts as they begin to scale Empower and onboard more users. At the same time, we also began looking at providers that Neuroflow partners up with and those that are treating patients on the platform. In a similar fashion, we saw a difference in user engagement among several providers. And after factoring for discrepancies, we see a general trend whereby smaller organizations are more likely to contain more active users. And this is indicative that smaller organizations in the first place can be key to Neuroflow unlocking highly engaged users. And further reflects that Neuroflow can tap into relatively larger organizations or its largest partners to really understand the reason for this difference and identify strategies that can allow them to boost engagement, taking inspiration from how some of the smaller organizations are handling customer engagement.
Yeah, so for a key variable we identified for improvement for Neuroflow was whether or not a patient is assigned a behavioral health specialist. As we can see, the patients which are more engaged with the app are more likely to have a behavioral health specialist, and those which are less engaged are more likely to not have a behavioral health specialist. We can see this through the very active and risk of churn clusters, which increase their percentages as we move from Node to Yes versus the really active and never active clusters, which decrease as we go from Node to Yes. And we can also see, it's interesting to note that of all those patients which don't have a behavioral health specialist, 51% have never interacted with the app at all. So there is quite a difference in the composition of each of those. So our recommendation for Neuroflow would be to assign the users which are at risk of churn to a behavioral health specialist to move them into that yes column, and then in doing so, increase their probability of becoming an engaged user.
In terms of now that we know which of the 4 clusters a user falls into, whether it's not very engaged to very engaged, we devised a list of data-driven recommendations on how to better reach out and re-engage users in each of the weaker clusters to push them into the stronger clusters. So here's just an example. We can't go through all examples for the sake of time. Here we're looking at the response rate of 3 different types of notifications: email notifications, push notifications, and SMS text notifications. You can see that the SMS text notifications has a consistently low response rate across all 4 clusters. One of the takeaways could be that we should think about trying to move as much of the outreach messaging out of SMS and into the email and push channels instead.
Awesome. And then just to wrap it up, we've summarized some of the recommendations that we laid out in the presentation. And I won't repeat them so that we have time for questions, but that wraps up our presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, team. I think we are just on target. So I think I don't see too many questions on chat, but I see a lot of thank yous from people at Neuroflow. So clearly a wonderful collaboration between a company that started at Wharton with Wharton roots and people at Wharton and Penn Wide. So thank you so much.